There's not much that I wanted to add to what Professor Reeves has already said about this particular time period, but there were a couple of notes that I wanted to add to kind of supplement some things that he had to say. In many respects, this time period is not one that we normally think of for missionary work from this perspective. A lot of the discussion of missionary work, as far as like standard church history texts, is focused on conquest. It's focused on imperial endeavors. But in many respects, what Wycliffe was doing and his followers, and what Huss was doing and his followers, was missionary work. They were essentially trying to spread their particular views on Scripture and the gospel to the people around them. And in many respects, what they are doing is forerunners to what will be done in the Reformation. In many respects, we can't draw direct lines between Wycliffe and Huss and the Reformers, but they do co-opt some of their ideas eventually as they kind of break away from the Catholic Church. So there are ways in which these particular individuals, Wycliffe and Huss, are constructed more as theologians really than missionaries. Understandably so. A lot of their focus was on new ideas or repackaging older ideas for a contemporary audience. But in doing that, those messages had to be promoted. And while some of that was done with the written word, a lot of it was done with preaching as well. And it's that preaching that in many respects we can see as being evangelistic or missionary in retrospect. Now, Professor Reeves covered a lot of the main ideas that Wycliffe and Huss were presenting, but I want to talk a little bit about some areas that he didn't really address, and that has to do with how this message was promoted. And to start off, we'll predominantly focus on the Lollards. Again, we're not saying a lot here, which is why I didn't come up with a PowerPoint per se. So from the Lollard perspective and the Wycliffe perspective, Wycliffe, of course, wrote a lot. He wrote some major works, he wrote some small tracts in English, but he also created a variety of sermon outlines. And it was those sermon outlines that become the important piece for the missionary work. So Wycliffe, as he's preparing these ideas, commissions some people to go around and preach his views, to share his message with the common people. And these people these preachers, these priests, use Wycliffe's outlines in order to spread the message to the common people. So they are Wycliffe's missionaries. Now, at the time, of course, they are considered to be heretical, they will be considered heretical. But in many cases, a lot of the ideas that they express, having been shaped by the Protestant Reformation, we would agree with a lot of things that Wycliffe had said. Now, these missionaries, these Lollard preachers, are often graduates of Oxford. So they've been trained in the academic side. They have gone through the academic work at a university on that side of theology. But as people who have looked at this from a missionary perspective have said, they didn't stay on that academic side, but instead were convinced to be more active in relating with the common people. And so these graduates that are going to be preaching Wycliffe's views are sent out by twos, armed with these sermon outlines. They go about barefoot, they carry these long staffs, and they're speaking in the common language. Remember, even at this point, a lot of the homilies that people would have heard wouldn't have necessarily been in their common language, if they hear much homilies at all. So to hear teaching in the common language would have been something that was radical along with Wycliffe's views. these Wycliffe, as well as these preachers that he's commissioned, they're opposed to settled priests. They're opposed to the mendicant orders as well. So they're kind of against a lot of the other people that are going around engaged in teaching. The main focus of the Lollards appears to be the teaching of Scripture, but they were also focused on particularly teachings of Scripture that could be easily remembered in some sense. Right? Teaching people the Lord's Prayer, teaching them the Ten Commandments, the so-called 7 deadly sins. These were things that would be accessible to people, would be easier to remember, would be, of course, very focused on practical aspects of life, and not as much on bold or grand theologies. In addition to their efforts in sharing the message, teaching the people these things, Wycliffe also encouraged the people, these preachers, to engage in what we might call pastoral duties today. Visiting the sick, helping the poor. Often it's kind of, this presentation that Wycliffe does and that these preachers do is that the priests have gotten to the point where they preach their sermons, they go down to the pub, they get drunk, or they engage in gambling. They are not concerned about the common people. That might have been true for some priests, especially priests in well-established places. But there were probably other priests, however, who were concerned about the flocks that they ministered to. There were 3 centers that the Lollards had: Leicester, London, and West England. And so they kind of, have these places as their centers, and they spread throughout England. Often they would hold secret meetings as well, where they, especially as Wycliffe's views start to get being viewed suspiciously. The Lollards, and probably why they died out, is that they don't really have a strong organization that develops. They don't have a stock set of beliefs or a confession like what you see with the Anabaptists that will develop, or the Lutherans, or some of the other Reformation type groups. There isn't a strong set of ideas and practices that is holding them together. Despite that, in those early years, they are successful, particularly among the common people, but even some governmental officials are persuaded by their preaching. And because of this, how successful they are with the common people, and they do have some governmental officials, it does give them some measure of protection, even as Wycliffe's ideas are being condemned, and it's kind of like they're heretical at worst, they're false at best. And so even while that's going on, he does have some protection, and the Lollards have some protection because they're so popular with the common people, and because of these few local officials that will protect them. Eventually, however, King Henry IV will adopt a variety of measures that are meant to stop Wycliffe's views and the Lollards. He gives the archbishops in England, the Archbishop of York, the Archbishop of Canterbury, they are given the authority to arrest those who follow Wycliffe. And so, there's this, it's not just trying to stop them teaching now. Now it's moved on to more punitive measures. But you still have the public and some authorities supporting them, and so it doesn't quite accomplish what he intends to accomplish. Eventually, though, it gets to the point where legislation is passed allowing the execution of the Lollards. It doesn't fully stamp them out, even into the time period of the English Reformation. But it does have more of an effect than some of the earlier attempts. Let's look at the Hussites a little bit as well. So Huss, of course, is very active in preaching his views, predominantly in Bohemia, but when Anne of Bohemia marries Richard II of England, the connection of these two countries allows for a cultural exchange to happen as well, especially among the universities of Oxford and Prague. So Wycliffe's thoughts and his writings come to Bohemia and to Huss. Huss has some slightly different views on Reformation and change. He's more focused on, the church as kind of the vehicle for Reformation, rather than some of the other things that Wycliffe's doing. Additionally, of course, Huss faces a lot of challenges. He continues to preach, though, which is, we could say, he's engaging in missionary efforts, even though we don't think of it that way normally, and he's not contextualized that way in church history classes. But he continues to preach throughout Bohemia, despite 3 excommunication orders. He's excommunicated 3 times, yet he's still going around preaching these things, because there's a lot of support from the common people. But a 4th excommunication order comes out that essentially puts Bohemia under interdict. And interdict meant that the sacraments could not be performed, so marriages, baptisms, etc. So in order to kind of alleviate this stress, Huss goes into exile, but he continues to preach. When he dies, the people of Bohemia continue to support him. And so there's a variety of efforts to try and create religious freedom in Bohemia. And when one of Huss's opponents becomes king of Bohemia, he's been in the Holy Roman Empire, civil war erupts. Crusades declared against the Hussites. There's a lot of conflict between them. But eventually the upper class Hussites form the National Church of Bohemia. So it kind of breaks into upper class Hussites, lower class Hussites. The Hussites, of course, are facing a lot of persecution from the Catholic Church, and the upper class is willing to compromise. The lower class doesn't like this compromise, and so that leads to the upper class siding with the Catholics to persecute the lower class. But in the midst of all of this, there is still that effort of sharing his message. The Hussites, particularly the upper class, would later join with other groups from a couple of different regions to form the Unitas Fratrum, or the Unity of the Brothers, which did grow and form the first Protestant church in Bohemia once Protestantism develops. The group would have to go underground for a while and eventually became more well known as the Moravians. And we'll pick up with the Moravians in another session. But I wanted to kind of present some of these connections. So again, Wycliffe and Huss, we don't normally think of as missionaries, we think of as theologians, but their activities in preaching, as well as the activities of their followers, do reflect this kind of evangelistic impulse that's present in European Christianity, although this one more focused internally in Europe than the external focus that we saw in the previous session. That leads us now to the time of the Reformation. And in the Reformation, of course, we'll see this continued development of missionary effort, Catholic missions continuing in the various places that Spain is going to, Portugal is going to, France is going to, but then also now Protestant missionaries will start to go throughout Europe. Eventually, we'll start to see some missionary effort into the 17th century with the Native Americans from English missionaries, etc. And so that's kind of where we're going in the next session of the class.